At what moment does a person stop being themselves and become someone they would have once condemned? We like to believe that evil is something external, that it's out there in other people, distant lands, long gone times. We, on the other hand, are decent. We pay our taxes, greet the neighbors, return lost wallets. But here's the question: how deeply is that darker side buried within us? The side we refuse to see. What would happen if circumstances tore us inside out? How much would it take for a polite person to turn cruel? Psychology has long provided a disturbing answer. The line between good and evil isn't a brick wall. It's a fragile veil torn by the first strong wind. Think back. When was the last time you did something wrong simply because you knew no one would catch you? A stolen idea, a pirated film, a borrowed neighbor's Wi-Fi. Harmless? Perhaps. But these tiny moral slips are often the opening notes in a much darker symphony. Evil doesn't arrive with thunder. It begins in silence, in small internal compromises. History gives us no shortage of warnings. One of the most unsettling is the case of an American soldier, a man who just weeks before was drinking beer with friends and listening to country music, who ended up at the center of an international scandal for torturing prisoners in Iraq. What happened? Did he become someone else? Or did his environment simply unlock a side of him that had always been there? We are not static. Our behavior is fluid, like water, shaped by the container we're poured into. This thought is terrifying, because we like to believe we have a solid character. But the truth is, personality isn't concrete, it's clay. And if today you are righteous, it doesn't mean tomorrow you won't become someone entirely different. In 1961, one of the most chilling psychological experiments took place, the Milgram experiment. Volunteers were asked to administer what they believed were electric shocks to another person whenever they made a mistake. A man in a lab coat assured them it was necessary, scientific, and 65% of participants went all the way up to the deadly 450 volts. They weren't monsters. They were just like you, just like me. They weren't threatened, they weren't paid, they weren't coerced. They were simply told, it must be done. And they obeyed. Evil rarely announces itself as a choice. It slips in through compliance, through silence, through the desire to be seen as good in someone else's eyes. And if you believe you'd never do such a thing, know this: so did they. We are raised in a world that conditions us to obey. School, the military, the workplace, all of them operate on hierarchy and control. We're taught, respect authority, don't ask too many questions. And when someone eventually tells us to do something wrong, we're more likely to obey than to question, because it's easier, because it's not my responsibility, and that is where the descent begins. Not with a shout, but with silence. How much evil can be excused with the words, "I was just following orders"? The second step in the descent doesn't begin with an action. It begins with a voice you choose to obey. We live in a culture where hierarchy is stitched into the fabric of daily life. From early childhood, we're taught to trust adults, believe teachers, and assume that those in power know better. A uniform, a title, a confident tone, these become symbols of authority, and with them comes trust. But that's where the danger begins, because authority often becomes the shield behind which evil hides. Think back to the Milgram experiment. People pressed buttons believing they were electrocuting another person simply because someone in a lab coat told them to continue. They weren't sadists. They weren't coerced. They simply trusted the symbol, the coat, the voice, the calm reassurance. This pattern is not unique. It has repeated itself throughout history. One of the most haunting examples is the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War. In 1968, American soldiers, acting under their commander's orders, slaughtered an entire village of unarmed civilians, elders, women, and children. Only one man, helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson had the courage to intervene, placing himself between the soldiers and the villagers, threatening to open fire if the killing didn't stop. He was condemned, labeled a traitor, but he was the only one who refused to obey evil. Why did the others go along with it? The answer is the same: the power of authority. The commander ordered it, the system allowed it, responsibility was diluted, and a man who just yesterday laughed over lunch now stood at the center of a massacre. He didn't feel guilty, he was just doing his duty. This mechanism is subtle and dangerously effective. It works not only in war zones and laboratories, but also in offices, schools, and homes. How many times have you remained silent in the face of injustice because your boss said so? How often have you told yourself, it's not my place? That's how it's done. It's not up to me. That's how tolerance for wrongdoing is born. Evil stops being foreign. It becomes routine. It flourishes, especially in bureaucratic systems. Adolf Eichmann, the man who orchestrated the logistics of mass deportations during the Holocaust, appeared at his trial not as a monster, but as a mild-mannered clerk. Polite, reserved, just following orders. His demeanor inspired philosopher Hannah Arendt to coin the term the banality of evil. Evil that doesn't scream, doesn't snarl, doesn't threaten. Evil that sits behind a desk and stamps papers. These people don't thirst for violence. They don't fantasize about cruelty. They just don't ask questions. And that's what makes them dangerous. The second transformation happens when you abandon moral initiative, when you stop asking what's right and wrong and start outsourcing that judgment to those who know better. But the truth is, no one knows better than your own conscience what's right for you to do or refuse to do. Historian Timothy Snyder once wrote, "The most dangerous illusion is believing that this can't happen in your country, your society. History proves it happens everywhere." So if today you're telling yourself, I would never do that, try asking a different question. Would you ask why? Would you dare raise your hand and say no when everyone else is silent? Evil thrives in silence. It feeds on obedience. And the more we train ourselves to comply without reflection, the more we erode our own will. What are you willing to do if you know there will be no consequences? The most brutal acts are often not driven by hatred, but by the feeling that the person committing them is no longer themselves. They vanish into the crowd, dissolve into the system, hide behind someone else's words, and then what once seemed unthinkable suddenly becomes possible. The third step in the descent is the refusal to take personal responsibility. It's the moment a person stops acting as an individual. They become just a cog in the machine, a placeholder, a moving part of a faceless structure. They no longer feel they are the one hitting, shouting, threatening. No, now it's we. It's that's how it works. It's not my fault, I was just playing a role. This is how the psychological mechanism of de-individuation works. You see it clearly in crowds. People smashing windows, starting fires, or turning violent during protests are often ordinary and polite in daily life. So, what happens? They lose their sense of identity, and the internal brakes of morality vanish because they feel anonymous, unseen, free from blame. A mask, a hoodie, a uniform, a screen name, all of these provide the illusion of invincibility and impunity. Zimbardo conducted an experiment to illustrate this effect. He left two identical cars, one in a rough neighborhood in the Bronx, the other in quiet Palo Alto. The car in the Bronx was vandalized within hours. The one in Palo Alto remained untouched. Why? Because in the first case, anonymity reigned. In the second, there was a chance someone would recognize you. Same car, different setting, completely different outcome. When people feel they can't be seen, they do things they wouldn't dare in the light of day. This also explains why cruelty thrives in war, prisons, and armies. Uniforms and orders blur identity. A person no longer feels like I, They become we. They say, it wasn't me, it was the command. It wasn't me, it was the war. It wasn't me, it was the system. And behind those words, they allow themselves to do things they would otherwise consider barbaric. Today, the effect is especially visible online. Behind avatars and fake names, people write things they would never say aloud. They insult, humiliate, harass, because they think, no one will find me, so they feel they can do anything. But the real question is, if no one sees you, does that cancel your conscience? If you feel invisible, do you become someone else, or just reveal who you've always been beneath the mask? Some of the darkest pages in human history were written by those who hid behind uniforms, collectives, and anonymity. During the Nazi regime, executioners killed millions and did not feel guilty. They didn't say, I murdered, they said, I served. In Rwanda, 1994, neighbors slaughtered neighbors with machetes because everyone else was doing it, because the radio told them to, because otherwise they'd kill me. Responsibility melted like ice in the sun. Conscience was replaced with fear and herd instinct. And if you're thinking, I'd never do that, ask yourself a different question. What would I do if everyone else did, if I wore a mask, if I wasn't alone, but just a part of something bigger? Salvation lies in awareness. You are you, not your uniform, not the crowd, not the order. Only you are responsible for what you do, which means that no matter where you are, you must remember, even when no one is watching, you are. The fourth step, perhaps the most dangerous of all, begins with the quiet death of empathy. At this stage, compassion fades, and in its place comes detachment, then cruelty. The moral impulse gives way to indifference. The heart no longer aches for the suffering of others because what's in front of you is no longer a person, it's it, the enemy, vermin, animal. This is how dehumanization begins. It's one of the oldest psychological defense mechanisms in the world. To strike, you must convince yourself you're not striking a person. To kill, you must believe you're not killing an equal. Wars, genocides, mass executions, they're almost always preceded by propaganda, rhetoric, and imagery that turn human beings into objects. In the 1990s, when Serbian forces slaughtered Bosnians, they were called lice, trash. In Nazi Germany, Jews were depicted as parasites, as a disease. In Rwanda, the Hutu labeled the Tutsi cockroaches, and if there are too many cockroaches, you step on them. Psychologist Albert Bandura conducted a chilling experiment at Stanford. Participants were told to administer punishments to members of another group. Before starting, they overheard, in truth, it was staged, the other group being labeled. One group was called animals, the other intelligent and understanding. Can you guess who received harsher punishment? We like to think we're above cruelty, but once someone says they're not like us, our internal resistance begins to crack. We look away. We stop feeling. We allow what we'd normally call barbaric to happen. Look at the world today. How many times have you heard people say things like, they're scum, they don't belong here, we need to cleanse our society? How often do politics, media, and ideology use language of degradation? It works, it's effective, because the moment we strip someone of their humanity, we open the gates for evil, and we do it willingly. It's easier to kill in war when what's in your sights isn't a face, but the enemy. It's easier to torment in prison when the inmate is no longer a name, but a number. It's easier to insult online when you're not talking to a person, but to a label: traitor, idiot, sheep, fascist. The deeper you go in this game of language, the less of your own humanity remains intact. History is filled with examples. During the Japanese occupation of Nanking, soldiers committed atrocities: mass rape, executions, torture. They had been taught that Chinese civilians were not human. They were raised on a rhetoric of superiority, and they believed it. They felt entitled. But you're different, right? You think for yourself. You see the human in others, or do you? You get angry at people who speak differently, vote differently, look differently. You say, "It's just a joke? I don't mean it," but language is never harmless. Language shapes thought, and thought shapes action. When you call someone a creature, you are paving a road someone else may walk with a clenched fist or a gun. This is the fourth stage of the descent, where evil takes shape, cloaked in patriotism, righteousness, and duty. You no longer feel like you're doing something wrong, you feel like you're doing what's right. What makes you a hero? The absence of evil or the willingness to fight it. The fifth and final step is not a fall, it's a choice. After you've stared into the face of darkness, in yourself, in others, in the system, only one question remains. What now? What will you do with this knowledge? Will you stay silent, turn away, or will you rise and do what most people are too afraid to? Philip Zimbardo, after exploring the darkest corners of human nature, didn't leave us in despair. On the contrary, he showed us that even in the bleakest of circumstances, it's possible to resist, not just by refusing to become a monster, but by choosing to become a hero. But a hero isn't someone flawless, not someone with superpowers. A hero is someone who steps forward when others retreat, who says no when everyone else is silent, who takes the hit so others can breathe free. Zimbardo calls this everyday heroism, not epic gestures, but small, powerful actions. Standing up for someone being bullied, asking the hard question when everyone is afraid to speak, refusing to follow orders that betray your conscience. These may seem small, but it's precisely such choices that build resistance to evil. History remembers those who dared to act. Sophie Scholl, a young student who handed out anti-Nazi leaflets knowing she would be executed. Witold Pilecki, who volunteered to enter Auschwitz to expose its horrors. Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, people who chose truth even if it cost them their reputation, freedom, or lives. You may not be on a battlefield, but every single day you are in a moral arena. Every day you choose to speak or stay quiet, to walk away or step in, to obey or disobey. And it is these decisions that define who you are. Not slogans, not beliefs, not words, but the actions you take when no one is watching, or even more importantly, when everyone is, and you stand your ground anyway. Now you know evil is not an anomaly. It lives in all of us, but so does good. You are both the monster and the hero. It all depends on who you give the reins to. If this story made you think, leave a comment and tell me. What does it mean to you to be a hero? What choices have you made, and what choices might you face tomorrow? Subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this. Deep, intense, but honest. Here, we explore human nature, psychology, the power of choice, and how to become someone who doesn't fall, but rises. Thank you for walking this path with me. And remember, you are not who your circumstances try to make you. You are who you choose to be.